So I think most of us are here, so I'd like to officially welcome all of you to episode 7, I believe, of the Tipping Points webinar, where we ask the questions that matter about conservation and development. My name is Ashley Finmunda. I am a social investment associate at Oppenheimer Generations Philanthropies, and together with the very wonderful team at Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, we oversee the selection process of the JWO grant and then manage the grant going forward. It's been very exciting. I've been involved for the last two years, and I'm quite keen to introduce our top 3 to you. Now, before we get to that, the JWO Research Grant was established to honor the late Miss Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer and to continue her passion for the continent, for the environment, and for pioneering science. It provides a $150,000 grant to an early career African scientist who has an ambitious and scientific solution to a broad African challenge. Our selection process started early in May, and with the submission of a concept note, we had 332 applications from 29 unique African countries. The concept notes were then shortlisted and reviewed by the expert panel before a select few was invited to submit a full proposal. The full proposals have been reviewed, and today I am very glad to present the top 3 candidates of the JWO Research Grant 2022. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Peta Brom, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow and integrated green infrastructure planning at the University of Pretoria in collaboration with Aarhus University. Her work focuses on the integration of parks into urban spaces to maintain biodiversity. Next up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Alice Karanja, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry in Kenya. Her topics of expertise include innovation, diffusion and scaling, program impact evaluation on food systems, diets and nutrition, food choice and food environment, food value chains, livelihood resilience, gender empowerment, and social inclusion. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth le Roux, who is currently an assistant professor at the University of Aarhus in Denmark and a research fellow at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She is a South African large mammal ecologist and is specializing in the study of trophic interactions and the impacts that large mammals have on the structure and function of ecosystems. So the structure for today is that we'll have the 3 presentations, each 10 minutes each, so 30 minutes, and will be followed by a Q&A session. Please direct all your questions to the chat box, and Dr. Brom, it's over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. So the title of my proposal was Spatial Patterns of Urban Nature in the Savannah region. Now, cities are rapidly urbanizing in Africa. By 2050, it is predicted that 2/3 of the world's population will live in urban areas, and most of the expansion will happen in Africa. Although there is large spatial variation in rates of change across the 55 nations of Africa, the combined impact of high natural population growth and rural to urban migration means that Africa is urbanizing faster than any other continent. This places a huge amount of pressure on cities to expand infrastructure of all types to accommodate the resulting influx of people. And in many cases, this results in settlement established in undeveloped and open land. Now, urban planners do have tools for controlling how land use is expanded, such as spatial development plans, land use zoning schemes that determine what kind of land use rights people have and what can be built where. However, cities are expanding at a rate faster than we can accommodate, and we are losing critical green infrastructure. Now, urban green infrastructure includes a range of green plantings and spaces across a whole lot of different scales, from something as small as a green roof or a street tree planting all the way up to urban nature reserves. So when we plan it carefully, and we do systemic planning for green infrastructure. It provides biodiversity networks across the city, and it is a critical solution for sustainable urban development, solving urban and climate challenges by building with nature. It provides multifunctional benefits across several different realms. To start with, the social benefits, we've seen that people who grow up with regular access to nature in their communities, there are lower instances of psychosis. It provides opportunities for recreation and exercise, which is important for mitigating the non-communicable diseases associated with urbanization. In African communities, there's a strong spiritual connection with nature. We see the Zionist Christian community and apostolic churches praising in natural areas around cities. It's a place for social connection, and it can be used for education as outdoor classrooms, particularly for teaching biodiversity and environmentalism. Secondly, it is a really important component of climate change mitigation. We've all experienced at some point in our lives the hot rock in the sun. So when we build a whole lot of buildings and we pave over landscapes, we create a whole bunch of hot rocks in the sun that make cities hotter than the surrounding area. Now, green infrastructure is a very important mitigation strategy for combating urban warming within cities and creating refuges in extreme weather events and heat waves. But it's also, and it is also used for extreme weather to absorb flooding and extreme weather events. So the spatial arrangement and the careful planning of our green infrastructure is important for compact cities. Now, lastly, particularly in the African context, it's very important for provisioning. Peri-urban communities in Africa rely more heavily on green infrastructure for medicine, for food and urban agriculture, for livestock grazing, and for biofuel than we see in other parts of the world. So making sure that they have access to those ecosystem services and those provisioning spaces is important for them. And all of this is underpinned by biodiversity. And it's supported by biodiversity. And the better we are able to provide spaces that support biodiversity, the better the multifunctional benefits that these spaces can provide, the better the quality for people who want to have recreation and those other things. Now, unfortunately, Sub-Saharan Africa is trailing behind the rest of the world, and I'll focus on urban ecological research. In a recent systematic study on urban pollinators, just as an example, only 3% of the research was coming out of Africa, and most of that was coming out of South Africa. So it's really important that we start to do more urban biodiversity research across the continent, and that we spread our efforts into more of Africa. So the aim of my project is to influence urban spatial development plans, those planning mechanisms that we have to be able to to make systemic plans and use the information across different layers to bring out the best the most multifunctional benefits strategically within green urban space. But I also want to know what types of urbanism support biodiversity in Africa. And with this lack of information and big gap, the study focuses quite a lot on that. Now, traditional urban ecology studies have this rather kind of blunt conceptual metric for measuring urbanization. They look at urban cover as soil sealing. That's the amount of building and roads in a particular area that cover up the soil, and that is used as urbanization. Now, as a planner, I think of urbanization as having a temporal component that change over time. So in this case, I would have called that urban density. Now, it doesn't give us much information about the heterogeneity, the internal variation of typologies and of space that we see in cities. So I want to evolve this conceptualization of urbanization in urban ecological studies by leaning on a classification system that's been developed by climate scientists who were looking at similar issues called local climate zones. And this takes into consideration aspects like building height and spacing, as well as the amount of cover and green space available. Now, the research that I proposed builds on my current research. The current research project comes to an end in March. And I'm hoping to expand on what we've been doing in the last year under the GRIP project, which is the Integrated Green Infrastructure project funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. And what we've been doing is in the city of Tshwane, we've been building a map of green infrastructure benefits by bringing in different spatial data sets that provide information and indicate what kind of benefits are where. And this we're going to present to City of Tshwane. We've been working quite closely with them in terms of developing this tool. And they are going to be using it as part of the decision support process for planning for green infrastructure. And it identifies strategic areas where investment is needed in upgrading, and areas where we need to now start focusing on rezoning exercises because of the expansion that is predicted in the city. So the study is regional. It looks at British post-colonial cities in the Savannah region, with the idea that they would have a similar history and legislative kind of framework that they're working from, and some similar development histories in urban development, but also there is some comparability within the same biome. And I'd like to start to be able to make some generalizations about urban nature in African cities by doing a regional study. So I will assess the spatial variables and provide a set of indicator maps that will then be put together. And this will be compared with urban biodiversity data. So I'm going to go out into the field and collect urban biodiversity data, but also I will be working with a lot of citizen scientists, and I have partner citizen scientist organizations across these cities and across sub-Saharan Africa who can be recruited into contributing to data gathering, and also there will be capacity building for them through being part of an organized scientific endeavor. We then do analysis. I find that there's a lot we can now learn by looking at functional groups and changes and how different groups are occupying different parts of the city. And this is the kind of where urban biodiversity studies are at the moment, is understanding those nuances of the types of habitats that we're creating and how selection is happening within cities. And then I will produce a set of decision support tools and maps and disseminate them to planning officials. I'm targeting a minimum of 3 cities. And I think this is one of the strengths of the study, is that it's highly applied and it's immediately applicable. It can be immediately adopted and start to influence the way in which we think about cities and plan them over the next 10 years. So spatial development frameworks are typically revised cyclically every 5 to 10 years. Now, another strength is in the collaborators from across Africa. We have local hosting from the Turkana Basin Institute in Nairobi and Luanar in Lilongwe. The Biodiversity and Development Institute has a network of over 5,000 citizen scientists across sub-Saharan Africa. The AP Leventis Institute will be assisting. They have a PhD student in Nigeria who's currently surveying birds across 7 different cities, who's willing to collaborate on this project. In Cape Town, where I am based, at the University of Cape Town, I will be hosted by the Climate Systems Analysis Group with co-mentorship from the University of the Western Cape Environmental Sciences Department. And the UWC we will partner. I will provide some capacity building on urban analysis, and they will provide some technical support for some of the GIS, and a similar relationship will exist with CSAG. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brom. I particularly liked your explanation of that hot rock in the sun, because I know it's something that everyone can relate to. And I think your sort of urban project is fascinating. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Alice Karanja to take us through her proposal and research area. Thanks. Dr. Alice?
Good afternoon, everyone. From Nairobi, my name is Alice Karanja. I'm a postdoc researcher at World Agroforestry, and the title of my proposed research is Mainstreaming Neglected and Underutilized Crop Species for Food and Livelihood Resilience in Sub-Saharan Africa, which I fondly abbreviate as NASRI. All right, so in this presentation, I'm first going to tell you about myself and my research interest, and then I will speak about the NASRI project in terms of its context and relevance. So about me, as I've mentioned, I'm Alice Karanja. I'm Kenyan. I have PhD in sustainability science from the University of Tokyo in Japan, where I graduated in 2019. And for the past 2.5 years or so, I've been working as a postdoc research fellow at World Agroforestry Center, where we look at the impact of agroforestry and trees on sustainability of environment and livelihoods. I'm also a member of the Young Scientist Group, which is a UN initiative that is mainstreaming youth issues in agri-food systems. When it comes to my research topics and the work that I do at ICRAF, we mostly push for local food systems that are more diverse and linking agriculture to nutrition, looking at the landscape changes and dietary changes, for example, rural-urban linkages, and looking at how the food flows and food environments change when it comes to production diversity and foods that are available in the markets. Then we also look at the interplay between agricultural biodiversity and dietary diversity, particularly for women and children who can regard as the vulnerable population groups when it comes to issues of nutrition. And while these supply chains or supply systems are very important, it is equally important to ensure that the production is consistent with the consumer or the demand system by understanding consumer characteristics, their preferences, their needs, their food choice behavior, and how they interact with the local food environment. And in response to the JWO call for this year, I would like to diversify and at the same time narrow the focus to understand the role of the neglected and underutilized crop species, which are also sometimes called orphan crops or the traditional crops, and how they associate or how they can deliver impact for livelihood diversification and dietary diversification. So why is the issue of nutrition important? We understand that many low and middle income countries, not just for sub-Saharan Africa, are in the process of nutrition transition and experiencing shifts in their food systems. And this transition is also associated with malnutrition in all its forms. And I'm going to make reference to the 2021 Global Nutrition Report, which shows that there is an unacceptably large number of people who are still affected by malnutrition in all its forms. So here we are talking about overnutrition, undernutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies. And this mostly affect women and children. We also see that from the same report that was delivered last year, globally, no region meets recommendations for eating enough healthy foods or limiting unhealthy foods. For example, we are seeing that in the case of Africa, we are seeing a negative deviation whereby when it comes to healthy foods like fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes, and whole grains, we are seeing that Africa is mostly falling far below the dietary recommendations that are made by WHO and other international organizations. But then when it comes to the unhealthy foods like red meats and red and processed meats, we're seeing that Africa is far above the maximum recommendations. And then the healthy burden of poor diets is substantially rising. So we are having cases of diets that are low in the healthy foods like fruits and vegetables, and also diets that are high in, the unhealthy foods like processed meat and red meats and other convenient food like the sugary drinks, leading to continued coexistence of forms of malnutrition. So we are having more people who are obese, they are overweight, and at the same time, we are having the coexistence of underweight situations. So this nutrition transition and changes has an important ramification when it comes to delivering impact for the global goals. And this is particular for SDG number 2, which focuses to zero hunger, that is ending hunger and ending all forms of malnutrition, and also looking forward to doubling the productivity and incomes. And all these have interlinkages to different goals in terms of, for example, issues of health, issues of income. There is also issues of climate changes that are all interrelated and interlinked. So in the proposed research, we aim to transform the local food systems by delivering healthy diets through diversification of local food systems. And what is the problem? The problem is that, especially in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, we have a reliance, or we are seeing a reliance on a narrow focus on a few crops that are nutritionally limited. Quite often we talk about maize, rice, and wheat. And in some cases like West Africa, we would see like cassava. And then there is low agricultural productivity and infestation from pests and diseases. And this precludes opportunities for diversification of livelihoods, health issues, and nutritional benefits that can be associated with diverse diets. And in the recently released report by the UN FAO on state of food security and nutrition, we are seeing that healthy diets are no longer affordable. In fact, the UN states that it is time that we think about how we grow and consume our food. Now, the local food systems, or diversification of local food system and agricultural biodiversity, provides an efficient pathway to address these issues in such a way that we are able to support the availability and access to a greater diversity of nutritious foods. We shorten supply chains, especially for fruits and vegetables that are highly perishable, and therefore curbing the issue of food waste and food loss. And then there are also ecosystem services that you can be able to derive from agricultural biodiversity, and also expanding opportunities for income generation. So what are the orphan crops, or the neglected and underutilized crop species, and how can they deliver impact for food security, nutrition, and livelihood? Just for information, the orphan crops, or the NUS, these are crops which can either be cultivated on farm or collected or foraged from the wild, that have been left at the margins of the research investment and development when it comes to their potential in delivering impact for livelihood and diets. However, they play a very important role in local food systems. To start with, orphan crops diversify and increase nutritional quality of local diets because of the nutritional value that they deliver in terms of micronutrients and macronutrients and phytochemicals. The other thing is that orphan crops are seasonal in nature, meaning that they are able to be available at different times of the year, of course, varying depending on the species and the agroecological conditions and zones, and therefore providing essential foods during the lean season when other food sources may be in short supply. And at the same time, due to their high tolerance to drought, because orphan crops, they are native and adapted to local agroecological conditions, and therefore they are very important at times when other food sources are not available. And at the same time, I would also say that they play a very big role when it comes to women empowerment, because women are often the custodians of traditional knowledge when it comes to preparation and production of these traditional crops. And therefore, the scaling up of orphan crops provides women with an opportunity not only to diversify the household diets, but also create opportunities for income generation and livelihood opportunities. So what is the objective or the aim for the nursery project? So as I have mentioned in that introduction, the nursery project is situated at the interface of building resilience for food security, livelihoods, and optimal use and conservation of agricultural biodiversity. So we explore how cultivated and wild orphan crops, ranging from vegetables, fruits and tubers and legumes, and looking at how the orphan crops can provide solution to this nexus. So we collaborate with the local communities and relevant stakeholders to review and push the existing knowledge boundaries for the orphan crops across rural urban landscapes and bridge some of the major knowledge gaps in this interface. We aim to conduct this research in Kenya and Zambia as our case studies, as they perfectly exemplify this nexus. And we're going to use mixed methods and multiple study sites. So essentially, the aim is to co-develop solutions with communities, as I have mentioned, in Kenya and Zambia, using a combination of survey tools. So first, we assess the food production diversity through household farm surveys. And from there, we get to look at the consistency of this diversity with dietary diversity by analyzing the food consumption diversity. And then we get to the communities for priority setting through focus group discussions so that we can prioritize the diversity of the orphan crops for food, for income, and also develop seasonal harvest calendars that can be able to identify which crops are being produced when and what is their nutritional value or the nutritional gaps that they are filling. So just to mention one of the outputs that we'll get from this work is developing crop portfolio as a decision-making tool for promoting diversity. So portfolios are simply combination of crop species, both wild and cultivated, that could provide year-round harvest and address key micronutrient gaps in local food systems. So we'll customize recommendations for promoting greater diversity of crop species on farms, and this could range from fruits, leafy vegetables, tubers, legumes, and all the foods that are important in local food systems. So here I'm giving an example of work that we have been doing at ICRAF, well, although this one focuses more on the food trees or trees that provide different types of foods, for example, fruits and vegetables or seeds and nuts. So here we would map like all the foods that are available throughout the year and match that according to the months of food insecurity. So we are able to tell throughout the year which food crops are available and how is that consistent with the months of food insecurity, so that we can address the nutrient gaps by matching prioritized foods with nutrient content data. And then we see how that supplies nutrients and food, which is like a direct impact and possible income that can be the farmers are able to get by selling the surplus, neglected and underutilized crops. So in summary, I would say that Sub-Saharan Africa is confronted with a triple burden of malnutrition and emerging non-communicable diseases. The dietary factors, risk factors are leading cause of morbidity and mortality due to inadequate diets. And there is an emphasis from international organizations on the need to transform our food systems and push to deliver healthy diets with a focus on nutrient food. And the neglected and underutilized crops and local food system provide opportunities to avail micronutrients and macronutrients, and these foods can diversify and complement the staple-based diets that we experienced in Sub-Saharan Africa. And due to the seasonality nature of the neglected and underutilized foods that are available at different times of the year based on species and agroecological zones, then we have an opportunity to provide essential foods during periods of food insecurity or during the lean seasons. And then considering now seasonality of production, the portfolios that we are going to develop from this research can be promoted for year-round harvest and for delivering key macronutrients in diets. Thank you so much for listening, and back to you, Ashley.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Karanja. I think food security is at the foremost of everyone's mind, because it's such a problem across the continent, and utilizing what we have is an incredibly important resource that we should be tapping into. For our final presentation, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Elizabeth le Roux to take us through her research.
Thanks, Ashley. All right, so I want to start by pointing your attention to the 30 by 30 initiative. So you probably heard about this. This is a global initiative where the global conservation community is aiming at conserving 30% of terrestrial and aquatic habitat by 2030. And coming up to COP15, I think there's already about 50 countries that committed to this initiative. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because I think that these kinds of initiatives are really commendable in the level of ambition for conserving protected areas, but that there's a lot of the implementation of this kind of initiative is by no means straightforward. There's a lot of really important considerations that we need to heed when deciding how and where to protect space for nature. And I want to highlight just 3 of them. So firstly, I think we need to be very pragmatic in understanding that we are a growing population, and there will always be competing land demands, and that these competing land demands oftentimes clash with biodiversity conservation demands. But it is important to know that not all of the competing land demands clash equally. I think secondly, it's important to point out that as conservationists and from a conservation perspective, we are quick to want to conserve the more intact landscapes and the less degraded landscapes, the ones that would make most sense for biodiversity conservation. But in doing so, we are we're placing the burden of protection on the shoulders of local communities, and oftentimes denying them this the right to development. And then lastly, I want to point out that as conservationists, I think we have a responsibility to think long term, and we need to know that we're standing at the precipice of spending a lot of money and a lot of effort in trying to conserve these areas. And we need to make sure that what we decide to continue to conserve today and the places that we decide to add to our protected area repertoire is still going to be there in 100 years. And it's going to be there, and it's also still going to be a functional system in 100 years from now and more. So we need to think about how do we allocate protected area in a way that will ensure the long-term ecological viability and the continued integrity of the ecosystems that we're trying to protect. And it's to these 3 aspects that I think that this project can contribute to. So this is a map that was published in 2020, and it shows the structural connectivity between protected areas in Africa. The blue here is protected areas, and then the non-intact land shown in yellow and intact land in green. And here in this paper, they use the human footprint index to decide what is intact land and non-intact land, and defined a protected area as structurally connected if it was separated from other protected areas by intact land. And they showed that globally, less than 10% of protected areas are structurally connected to each other. And that in Africa, this value is a lot lower, 0.5%. I think that we could probably argue the exact percentages here and argue at what threshold of this human footprint value does it really switch from an intact system to a non-intact system. But I think that the message to take home here is that even though we have a lot of protected area in Africa, many of them are very isolated, and they're becoming increasingly more isolated. And isolation in protected areas, this is a problem because without dispersal and without gene flow, your populations become more vulnerable to extinction. So particularly in small populations, some unexpected stochastic event can drive a population to extinctions by lowering their numbers to a limit that is below a viable population number. And then if there's no opportunity to be augmented by other populations, then of course that population is at risk of extinction. And the other thing that happens with a loss in connectivity is that you also run the risk of disrupting gene flow. And genetic variability is a prerequisite to be able to respond to changing environments. And of course, we're expecting quite a lot of changing environments in the future with the climate change scenarios or the projections. So we need to do everything in our power to make sure that species have the capacity to adapt to these changing environments. Okay, so connectivity is key to conserving long-term resilient ecosystems. And as ecologists and as conservation managers, we recognize this, and it shows in our attempts at maintaining metapopulations and having all these translocation programs. But as you can see from the pictures, we are only really able to focus on the big and hairies and the charismatic and visible ones. But of course, there's a lot of species that are below the radar and that also need to have connectivity between systems, and that also need to be able to disperse and have gene flow amongst populations. And in Africa, I think that the most obvious and most straightforward solution to this connectivity issue is to have functional rangelands, well-functioning rangelands. So I'm talking about space that is predominantly meant or it supports production, it supports livelihoods, but it has it's where the maintenance and the management and movement of people and cattle is such that it promotes this connectivity between systems. So it's space that might not in itself be a prime habitat, but it retains the ecological processes and the fundamental ecological characteristics that allow for dispersal and gene flow. So this is what this project is about. I want to be able to work towards demonstrating and quantifying this connectivity that we can possibly achieve by having these functional rangelands. And I want to ask the question, under which conditions and to what extent does pastoralist and the movement of cattle promote a functional ecological connectivity between protected but isolated wilderness ecosystems? And this is an important question to ask, I think urgent question to ask, because rangelands and traditional pastoralist practices are under immense pressure at the moment for a variety of reasons. For one, pastoralist communities are facing huge population growth, which means they have increasing competition for ever more degraded land. They're also competing with different land demands from tourism and from agriculture. And where previously the pastoralist communities were able to move over vast distances, they have a lot of restriction in mobility at the moment. So they can't follow seasonal changes in resources. So all of this means that pastoralists are pushed to become more sedentary and to try and intensify and diversify their income generating activities. So all of this ends up leading to unsustainable cattle densities, land that becomes parceled out and privatized and fenced, and increased dependence on crop agriculture. So what I would want to do in trying to quantify this connectivity in functional rangelands is to divide it up into three different aspects of connectivity. So connectivity in gene flow and what the consequences would be to genetic diversity. I want to look at the connectivity in nutrient flow and how this might have consequences for the potential for carbon sequestration, but also for the maintenance of nutrient niche space within the rangelands. And then I want to look at connectivity for actual organism movement and what this might mean for species dispersal potential. And the way I see it is that there will be a PhD student employed on each of these topics to be in charge of each of these topics. And so I have an affiliation with Pretoria University. I'm a fellow at the Mammal Research Institute, but I am based in Denmark. So I think that what we'll do is we'll first identify 3 early career scientists, African early career scientists, to act as the main supervisor for each of these PhD students. And then, of course, they would then be supported in supervision and everything else with a whole network of people, obviously from Africa, and more senior scientists, because of course this is a very multidisciplinary study. So we would need people from with expertise in population genetics and rangeland specialists and social scientists. My own expertise is in trophic ecology and zoogeochemistry. So I see my own involvement more with the nutrient flow component and the organism movement component, but we would need to get a whole network of people together to make this project work. And I think that together we would be able to demonstrate this connectivity, the utility of rangelands as in providing this ecological connectivity between protected areas, and hopefully be able to garner some support, political and institutional, for maintaining rangelands in the semi-natural state that we need them to be able to support our protected areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. le Roux. I think that was fascinating, and I think I'd never thought about how rangelands could be so important, especially in this sort of interconnection and this connectivity. I see our chat room is full of questions for all 3 of you, so I'd like to invite Dr. Brom and Dr. Karanja to turn on their cameras and their mics as we head into the Q&A section. And maybe starting with you, Dr. Brom, Ida Breed has asked, will this method include members from society communities within the research process, or is it focused on GIS and remote sensing data? I think the second part says, please expand on the citizen science that will be employed in the data collection.
Okay, so yes, members of society will be included. The citizen scientists will be involved in collecting data in the field, but so there will be standardized methods that will be deployed into the project, and then they'll be able to also see the results of their observations and what it means for the city. And I guess that also feeds back to them around sort of urban biodiversity management initiatives that they can undertake in their own space. So it becomes a much more kind of involved. It can be much more involved in terms of the way in which it plays out and gets integrated on the ground. And then what is the second part of the question?
The second part was, please expand on the citizen science that will be employed in the data collection.
Yeah, I think I answered that question.
So, yeah. Great. Now for Dr. Karanja, are you targeting specific orphan crops in your study, and will your study include feasibility analysis or experiments of specific crops, or does it build on community knowledge and feedback?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So to begin with, the research will not target, specific orphan crops, because the aim is to diversify the system as much as we can. So we're going to, or rather we aim to collect, to identify and explore as many orphan crops as possible, because the overarching goal of this project is to, assess the adoption of the orphan crop portfolios and ensure that smallholder families have what you refer to in the next question about having year-round access to nutritious foods, while simultaneously diversifying their income generating opportunities and therefore enhancing their adaptive capacity. So the portfolios are location-specific combinations. They are aimed to ensure that at least 1 or 2 crop species are available for harvest in each month of the year, and at the same time, fill hunger gaps and specific nutrient gaps. So this will mostly have to work very closely with the communities to help us understand about, the diversity of crops that are available in their agroecological settings, which of course will vary depending on sites. But then we really do not aim to conduct any, experiments, but mostly gather knowledge from surveys and also group discussions with the stakeholders and the local communities.
Thank you so much. For Dr. le Roux, how do you propose that the protected areas are connected? Ida Breed says, I'm sure you are familiar with the peace parks and the lengthy process to connect these areas and the challenges they are also delivering. Do you have any proposals on how these challenges could be better managed? Example, overpopulation of elephants in Mabankudwe area that referred to the SA section of the Trans-Frontier Park. Will demonstration of the benefits be enough to overcome these challenges? And what more could be part of the motivation and evidence process? A couple of questions in there for you.
Yes, thank you for that. It's a good question because, of course, this process, for it to reach policy and actually make any change to how we manage rangelands and how and what we set in place to make rangelands, create rangelands in this vision of connectivity is, of course, a lot more than just this project. There's so much that needs to go into this, and it's such a lengthy process, and definitely just illustration of the benefits will not be enough. But I think one of the main benefits that I see from this project opportunity is to the combination of the people, this network. We need to be able to get people that are better than I at answering this question, in knowing how do we actually take this result and implement it in policy? How do we take it to the discussions that's going to be happening at COP15, for example? And also, I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that there's an opportunity here, because there's so much momentum in some. So I started specifically with this 30 by 30 initiative because I want to illustrate that there's so much momentum now, and there's so much money and effort that's being discussed to spend, and to that we need to use this opportunity to get in on that conversation. And really lend our voices to that conversation, and also show that because with these conversations that's happening around these issues and these initiatives that's planned for conservation and biodiversity conservation in the future, there's so many there's a lot of nuance that is being discussed, and these kinds of projects can feed into that, because I think one of the first things, especially, for example, with this 30 by 30 initiative that will come out, is that there's no one set of 30% that will address all of our conflicting demands on land. Are we managing for biodiversity? Are we, if we want to have equitable conservation, we want to have ecological services, and if we have these contrasting demands, there's no one 30% that'll work. So there's already discussions about how do we prioritize, and how do we allocate this effort. And I think that these kinds of projects would be able to use this momentum to add more nuance to that discussion, and show that we need to start thinking less about protected areas and non-protected areas, but we need to start talking about more integrated space. And definitely we need to take this further, and it's not just about showing the benefits, but hopefully with this build-up of this network of people, together we can go quite far beyond what is included in this particular project, and hopefully take it all the way to policy.
Great, thank you so much. For Dr. Brom, Michael Stiller asks, is there any African city that has no colonial influence?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I think the whole continent was colonized. So yes, but the variation in colonial histories is quite stark. So different parts of Africa were colonized by different European nations, and they brought different legislative frameworks and different cultures and different histories and different objectives for their different nations when they came.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
Thank you. For Dr. Karanja, Michael Stiller also asks, how has maize lethal necrosis disease conscientized the agro-ecosystem?
Can you read that again, Ashley?
Sure. So how has the maize lethal necrosis disease conscientized, I could be saying that very wrong, the agro-ecosystem?
Okay, that's a nice question that I cannot be able to answer exhaustively because I'm not a plant pathologist or an expert in pathology. But then I can answer and say that, you see, for many of these staple crops, maize included, and their improved varieties, they were introduced as a means of boosting agricultural productivity, as they have been tested in other regions, often outside, sub-Saharan Africa. However, such introduced crops and varieties do not always reflect the local environmental conditions, the local infrastructure or knowledge and resources available, especially to smallholder farmers. And as a result, they are not grown optimally and can fail in different local contexts, especially in the face of, climate change and environmental degradation. And furthermore, I would say that following the basic principles of agroecology and regenerative agriculture, reliance on few crops or a narrow diversity of crops also increases, risks associated with pests and diseases. Yeah, so sorry, Michael, I think I cannot exhaustively answer that question, but then just to give some perspective.
Okay, great. And then for the panel, what are the key leadership needs for environmental research in Africa?
The key leadership needs
Mm.
for environmental research in Africa.
Working with communities is important, and approaching, I guess, with humility and willingness to collaborate is critical.
Yeah.
Very important. Taking on board stakeholder needs and stakeholder conversations. So I think listening is a very important first step always, and understanding the issues and the complexities of what people are dealing with on the ground. So we can't set targets for biodiversity and for conservation until we've understood the full extent of the contestation and pressures on that from all sides, from political sides, from environmental sides, from economic sides.
Great.
I would, if I can add to that,
please.
I think one of the other, I totally agree with you, Peter, but I think one of the other also really important things that we need is that our problems are global these days, and our voices should also be global. We should have voices that's from everywhere. And of course, now I am specifically talking about African voices that needs to, be heard more clearly in these global discussions, because I think that Africa needs to take a much stronger leadership role in these global issues.
Yeah, I do agree with my fellow panelists and say that I think addressing the sustainability issues that are affecting Africa mostly call for, you know, going for the local solutions, like working with the communities, understanding perspectives, or rather understanding what is happening on the ground and then scaling up. But at the same time, we also have other, you know, like Elizabeth is saying, we also have other voices like the youth and women who really have incredible knowledge, who are really very much interested in, you know, conserving our biodiversity, environment, and all that, but then they need to be given a platform, they need capacity building, and also we need investment in terms of, you know, stakeholders coming in to support, especially the youth, because they really have a voice and they can be able to change the way we approach things. But then they just lack the capacity, they lack the platforms to raise their voices.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you and congratulate you on making it to the JWO Top 3 for 2022. I think it's the first time since I've been involved anyway that we've had an all-female. We had an all-female Top 6 and of course an all-female Top 3. And I'd like to make a very exciting announcement. So the next Tipping Points webinar is going to be a little bit different. It's going to feature a live stream of a panel discussion on post-growth or green growth, alternative development pathways for Africa, live from the Oppenheimer Research Conference on the 5th of October. One of you will be selected as our winner and will be announced will be awarded at the conference as well. So everyone stay tuned for that.